The run of show is I'm going to do about a 5-minute introduction of some of the challenges that are out there, give you a little preview of the BRC's, the Blue Ribbon Commission report coming up on the future of board leadership, which will be released at the Global Summit later this month. And we're going to talk about, as a group, some of the implications of what that means to board leadership, board composition, how the board engages, how they're accountable, and how they're transparent. So, referencing the press release, and obviously some of the things that are coming out on that report, we're in the midst of a significant business revolution with profound implications for companies and how they're governed. Businesses are confronting a wave of major, simultaneous, and I love this word, interconnected, because it's so true, trends that are redefining how companies create and preserve value. The report argues the pace and the scale of change require a different modus operandi from the governance model prevalent for the last 100 years, involving a greater speed of decision-making, proactivity, adaptability, and innovation. Simply put, you can't build a business fit for the 21st century with a board structure of the 19th century. It's prolific. In recent NACD surveys, directors report that changes in the regulatory climate, the prospect of economic slowdown, growing cybersecurity threats, amen on that, business model disruption, and worsening geopolitical volatility most significantly are having the most impact on them in 2019 in the boards they govern. Changes involved the tumultuous markets, the ever-changing trade policies, and perhaps above all, the technologies that are reshaping our social and economic life in powerful ways, present directors with new challenges every day. I love threes. For anybody who knows me, I remember stuff in threes for some reason. We put on your tables, actually, things that directors, through surveys, are saying are the top things that are really keeping them up at night, the T's and the C's. The T's, technology change, talent, the scarcity and the deficits in talent, and then trade, the turbulent nature of the trade. And then the C's, cybersecurity, climate, and culture. We are not going to talk about all these because we'd be up here, we'd be keeping you all day, at least. But we will talk about some of them, and particularly this engagement model. Directors play a more integral role in the strategy and oversight, and risk are becoming much more thoughtful about how they compose themselves, who you have on the board, how you get those skills and capabilities and leadership qualities that are so important to be able to govern today. In a recent NACD survey, 71% of directors reported that board leadership now is much harder than 3 years ago. And also 84% reported that performance expectations have increased for all board members. It's hard to do part-time. It's hard to do without full engagement. Almost 40% of directors cite the struggle to stay abreast of changes. And I'm all glad you're here to at least hear part of that. So, with that, I believe we have the implications on the slide, the 5 implications that the BRC. Do we? We didn't do that. Well, I'll talk about them. Okay, so these might be some of the note, if you take notes. But here's the 5 implications, and we're going to talk, like I said, about some of these. The deepening and the strengthening relationships with management and the board itself. Now, moving from a monitor and overseer to being a thought partner. What that evokes in my mind is when I started my board leadership, people saying there's a line between the board and management. The board does this, management does this. And some of that is blurring. Some of that is becoming different because of the challenges. The second thing, renewing board in skill sets and human capital. Getting the right capabilities in digital technologies, human capital, operations, marketing, and environmental issues. Third, agility and fluidity in how the board operates, moving away from just 4 meetings, not talking in between, when the dynamism is happening. And so how does a board engage? How does a board keep up with what is really happening and the implications that that has on the company's strategy and the company's risk. And it also involves talking about how committees handle that at the board. What goes to the full board? Do you need new committees? Because they're so workload. Look, I'm on the audit committee. We get everything, right? And we can't have that because so many of these are full board issues to deal with. The fourth thing, transparency to investors. Investors want to know, where were the Boeing directors? What is the statement? What were they thinking about? Not just to pick on Boeing, but they want to know about everything you're doing. What's your self-evaluation? How are you evaluating underperforming directors? How are you changing the board composition? And last but not least is the accountability that the board has. How does it evaluate itself? And how is it actually ever evolving and becoming productive? So, the last thing I'll say, and it's known to everyone in this room, the journey will not be easy. It will involve painful decisions about board members who are not fit for the future and challenging discussions with management teams where strategies may be stuck in the past. It will entail painstaking work to reinvent board processes, reshape behaviors, with a view to increasing the quality and information actually available to the board from inside and outside sources, and the candor and the rigor of discussions in the boardroom and the time on the agenda to do that. Last thing, capabilities. We talk about culture. What are the leadership capabilities that are pointed out in this study that will resound with everyone in this room? Courage, resilience, fortitude, and adaptability. There's a great quote from John Maxwell. I don't know if any of you read John Maxwell on leadership. And he says, there's no need to recreate a separate set of rules for business. Bring the same character, ethics, and values that guide your personal life, and you'll never go wrong. Okay. So with that, Sandra, we're going to start with you.
Okay.
So you hear that. You serve on multiple boards in leadership positions, very diverse boards, from utilities to mutual funds to hospitals, medical devices, healthcare, technology. You're in the middle of it. So when you hear these challenges, what are your thoughts on how board members can best equip themselves to tackle those implications?
Yeah. You know, you first think about why you do it, why you are even asking the question, and it's because you need to find a way for boards to deliver better quality services and products to the constituents that they serve. And to do that, their fundamental foundations just have to be as diverse and well-informed as possible. When we think about, for any of my boards, the kind of people and environment that we need to have, we make sure that the staff is good and the company's performing well. And then when we turn to the board, we say, we're not just selecting people to be board members. We're actually hiring directors. And we need then people who are lifelong learners, who are extremely comfortable with transparency because that's where our world is going, who are really focused on,
Thank you. We're getting feedback. We want to make sure we hear every word you say. Are you turning this one off?
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Sorry about the ears, folks.
Okay. Great. That sounds a whole lot better. My ears aren't ringing anymore. But in essence, we want people who really think about it as a job. And if you think about your day-to-day job, you always understand that there's a certain amount of learning that has to be done to be good at that job. You have to have someone who knows how to weigh risks and who's comfortable with taking appropriate risks. And it's a hard thing for me to say in a way, but we really do need to think about having not just younger people, but people who represent younger industries and thinking on those boards. One of my boards has someone on it who, and many of you will probably relate to this, if you open your cell phone and look at your bank account, there's something that pops up that says, we have an offer for you. And that offer may be for Starbucks when you usually go to Dunkin' Donuts or something like that. His company really does data mining and gets into the heads of people and tries to help drive business for his customers. That's a new way of thinking. It's a way of using that ton of data that's out there. We also think that it's important to really focus on this relatively new issue of director tenure. CEOs turn over about every 5 to 6 years. Directors are now being told that you shouldn't be there too long. So who's there long enough to think about the truly long-term interests of the organization? So we are looking for people who really understand all those different components. And with these changes, most of it's good, but then there's sometimes that boards overreact, and we may say, oh my goodness, we don't have a cyber expert, we're going to get one cyber expert and one marketing person and one this, and each person is told that's their job, and no one's looking at the big picture. So there has to be a focus on making sure that the board understands that its role is to understand the overall dynamics of the business. And then just a couple of other quick things. For the utility industry, one of the things we always hear is that, well, that's a relatively slow and steady business. It works out okay. But that business is seeing disruption that many industries are seeing, but we're seeing it in a way that is just astounding. If you think about your own homes, for those of you, some of you may have smart homes or solar or wind, and those kinds of products have apps that go with them. Those apps now have to tie into the overall systems of the company, which means that there's a cyber opportunity for someone to get in and threaten the company. So here we have this wonderful technology happening at the same time that we're trying so hard to fight off the cyber attacks. On the mutual fund business, we've been active investors for so long. Now we have ETFs. So my daughter, who's an analyst now at Goldman Sachs, says, Mother, how in the world are you working with the mutual fund company? Don't you know that makes no sense? But, there are different ways of thinking. So technology is changing. And finally, the medical device company is doing gamma knives and proton beams. And because technology is changing, it changes not just what we do, but where we do it. We may advance to protons here, but we're doing a lot more of our gamma knives in developing countries because they're more affordable. So those are just some of my general thoughts.
Yeah, excellent. I'm hearing a lot about board composition, for sure. A lot about how a board engages, understands the business model, both the opportunity and the risk, and the continuous learning, which obviously you're part of in terms of exploration here. So Peter, you lead an organization of, I'm sure now well over 20,000 board members. And the purpose of the organization is really to make more effective directors that actually can drive shareholder value. Or I just created it, but no, that's generally the purpose.
I'll take that into consideration for the next mission development that we do.
So how can board leaders, which obviously you are one and engage with every single day, change the dialogue and the engagement level in the boardroom to respond to these challenges that we've talked about?
Well, you mentioned something at the onset that I think we incorporated into this year's Blue Ribbon Commission report, which is, are you fit for future purpose? Mm-hmm. And when I look at, and the other statement you made is, are we operating our boards on a 19th century model when business is operating on a 21st century model? Those are two things that I think are critical to the success of our companies in thinking about how does leadership change the dynamics, how does leadership change the structure of the boards that we sit on. Because we are operating in a 19th century model in terms of boards. These are not, how many of you have been on boards for more than 10 years? The board that you're currently sitting on, you're on that board for more than 10 years. Well, that's relatively low.
Yeah.
Usually I ask that question and about 90% of the hands go up in the room. We have to stop thinking about directorships as Supreme Court appointments. They're not. And in order to be fit for purpose, you cannot think about it that way. If the business environment is changing as rapidly as we all know it is, from a cyber security perspective, from a technology perspective, from a competition perspective, competitive perspective, we cannot manage ourselves in a way that is outdated. We struggle every day with business trying to keep up with all these issues, and yet we look at our boards and go, well, you know, we got directors who've been on here for 20 years, and that's not a bad thing. In fact, that can be a tremendous advantage, as you said, in terms of the institutional knowledge of what have we done wrong in the past? What mistakes can we avoid because of this? But you can't have the whole board that way. And you have to think about the younger generation of directors, as you mentioned, Sandra. Different skill sets, different perspectives coming into the mix who can give you that view that may be a little different than the view that's there. So the leadership aspect of this is no longer, you know, if you're chair or your lead director, you chair a committee, is the convening aspect and thinking about what are the key issues. It's really who are the right people that are sitting around this table. Are they fit for purpose? Are they keeping current on the issues that are so prevalent today? I mean, our board meetings right now, it's amazing how much depth goes into the strategy discussions for a small nonprofit and the competitive issues. I know you all feel it in every discussion that you have around competition. It's changing. The competitors that you traditionally have looked out for over the past decade are not the ones you need to be worried about. It's the ones you don't even know who are coming into your space because they've developed a technological advantage, because they've moved faster than everybody else and are coming into your space and you don't even see them. And tomorrow, they disrupt you beyond disruption and now you're scrambling. So you really have to think about not just how we organize ourselves as a board, but you have to think about who are the people here that are going to change the discussion, change the dynamic in that board, and how do we as leaders of these boards think about that discussion in terms of the agenda, the transparency that we're talking about, how do we engage different partners, because you can't go it alone in this day and age. You've got to think differently about how you're going to engage, and that goes to the competitive environment as well. Some of your current partners may be your tomorrow's competitors. We use them all the time at NACD. We call it co-opetition.
Co-opetition,
But you got to keep a wary eye on the co-opetition because they can assume your market space pretty quickly if they get too much of that knowledge. So the leadership aspect is changing dramatically, and I think the biggest component of that change is talent. Mm-hmm. And it's talent around the boardroom table and how that has to be different than what it has been before.
So, Sandra, just picking up on some of the things you said before and what Peter just went through, one of the things you said to me as we were preparing was we need to spend less time looking in the rearview mirror and more time looking forward. That really resounds with me because all these things we're talking about are implications for the future. The study also talks about the quality of information, and it talks about internal, external, and it talks about level of engagement. Talk a little bit about, on your boards, how you're actually changing these dynamics in terms of future-looking, quality of information, and engagement.
Sure. So when we talk about not looking in the rearview mirror, you know, if you think about how boards have focused in the past, they've spent the majority of the meetings talking about the financials. And those financials can give us clues as to what might come in the future, but they tell you a whole lot more about what has already happened. Then look at the percentage of that time. It's between 70 and 80% that boards spend on the financial or related part of the business. They spend much less time on the strategic, and the strategic is where they need to be. So last week, for example, I was with one of my boards in New York. We spent 2.5 days totally on strategy. We did not allow there to be any typical operations discussions in that meeting. We had to be able to step back and think about what our strategy needed to be. And it doesn't end there. At each subsequent meeting, we don't just touch on, but we actually spend time on some component of that strategy each meeting over the course of the year. Now, to do that, we need to understand the dynamics, right? So we have senior leaders who have been very much accomplished in the business, who are now one focused on environmental, social, and governance, and one focused on, you name the topic. And they're bringing to us the information they have. The board is also responsible to take to them what we've learned. So I will be in about 3 weeks in a class on nuclear energy because I need to understand it better. I will take back what I learned from the perspective of the board member, and that will go into the discussion. Everyone comes to the table with information, and once we all have that common understanding, then we can start to set targets and strategies for where the company wants to be. One of my boards recently went through a merger, so we had the opportunity to recreate ourselves. New governance policies. How much education do you want? What do you want that strategy to be? It's a wonderful opportunity to think about how you build a business and not just tweak things around the edges.
Yeah, the strategy sessions that you describe, I want to peer a little bit into that because I think those critical away from other things, bringing in factors, exploring. I love the educational part of that too, which is you're all learning and you're bringing together what is an aggregate amount of learning to be able to then explore some of these issues. But just without giving us any, confidential stuff, just give us a little peer into what that agenda might look like. What are some of the things that you're doing in that strategy session to bring that engagement together, to bring that learning, and to come out with something that you can then use during the year to...
Yeah, we're trying very hard to bring not just the one single perspective of any topic. So the staff may say, these are, with regards to ESG, and I know we'll talk about that,
right,
but these are some of the things that are happening in the industry. And then they will, and the board will, say, here's the counter argument to that. We can't just have what we think might be the best argument. We have to have that counter argument, and we have to have a discussion about it. So the agenda will say, this is the landscape. These are some of the dissenting opinions about it, and then we have a discussion about what that is. Some of that we get from going to NACD sessions. We try to do some of those as a board. We can't get there as a full board to many of the things, but we'll try to have at least 2, 3, 4 people go, and you're always taking information back. The NomGov chair, and I chair NomGov for one of them, helps set the agenda, which means that you don't just get the staff's view. And it becomes a very well-considered and comprehensive discussion, but nothing is a given in that way.
Right. It sounds like you're looking at the opportunity and the risk using external forces. I always find that very helpful, right? You're looking at competitors. Peter, you mentioned this. You're looking at the competitive forces. You're looking at the customer side of things. You're engaging in what are those future disruptive trends. And that all requires the right people in the room. So, Peter, I know that NACD is really all over, not over as in over, all over it in terms of
just starting.
board composition. But give us a peer into that. What are some of the pearls this group should take back about things to think about, initiatives that NACD is doing to really change that board composition?
I'm not sure if that's the softball question I'm expecting or whether I can play off of
Just
something.
play it whatever way you want.
One of the things that I think that's really important about what you just said in terms of the agenda, and I know our board has shifted this, about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we did a Blue Ribbon Commission report on strategy development and how boards need to think differently about how you engage with management around strategy. And the crux of that really becomes that you need to do a deep dive around strategy. You focus your board meeting around strategy, but you do a deep dive in a certain period of time on your agenda in a different element. So that may be environmental issues, that may be geopolitical issues, maybe competitive issues that you're going to spend a lot of time digging in, but it draws you back to the strategy. And it draws you back to how are we executing against our strategy given the environment that we operate in, given the competitive issues that we're operating in. And I think so much of what you just said is critical to that, because our operations report for our board is about 20 minutes, if that. They have the financials. We assume they know how to read the financials and understand the business. Right. It's the competitive issues. It's the environmental issues. Are we pressure testing the assumptions that we based our strategy on? And do they still hold water given the dynamic environment that we're operating in? So I think that's a big part of looking at the agenda is where are we going to dive deep and look forward? Because you're diving deep around the issues that are going to impact your ability to execute on that strategy. And if things have changed, which they do, as we just talked about, you've got to be thinking about, well, how's that going to impact how we can execute and look forward? Because we may have to turn. And that was the big discussion in that strategy BRC development was, it's not that you're necessarily going to turn 90 degrees left, but you may have to jog about 10 degrees left in order to overcome an environmental issue that's just happened, a trade issue that's just happened that may impact how you execute. And the better informed you are and the better informed your board is about those issues and can have that time to go in depth around those things, the better capable you are to shift a little bit left and jog around that issue, as opposed to let it completely crush you and then you've got to turn hard left, and that requires a whole new set of skills that you're going to have to bring in. So that's a different dialogue. In terms of what are we doing around the talent and the people sitting in the boardroom.
One of the T's that's on the table.
Yeah, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here a little bit, but this
No, go
where,
ahead. And we're going to come back to it in terms of strategic initiatives, but I just want to get kind of the top level think about what are the board leaders thinking about board composition. Yeah. And then we'll come back to ESG because I know everybody's dying to hear that. If
you look at the statistics that are out there right now, 77% of the board members who were elected to public companies this year, so this past proxy season when the votes came in, 77% of them had never served on a public company board before. That's remarkable. And that's up from like 54% the year before. That means that we've got a whole cadre of folks coming in who are bringing specific skills to bear, because that's what we keep telling boards to go out and find that skill gap that you're missing on your board. But they don't have that board readiness that we've traditionally assumed when you go on a board, you've already brought experience from another public company board with you. So what we've done and we've been working on, and we didn't know that 77 factor when we started this, is our certification, which will be launched next month. We have been building for the last 2 years a certification program for directors. The idea being for new and prospective directors to have them come in with a proven baseline knowledge of what does it take to do this job. And that's where we started this whole dialogue. We actually brought, Barbara was part of this, we brought hundreds of directors in to redefine the job of a director, or to define the job. What do you actually do when you sit in that room? Then we brought in another hundreds of directors, set of hundreds of directors, to actually write questions about how do we test this to know that you can accomplish this. We've had over 2,000 people involved in this development, and it's going to go live in October. It's pretty exciting, actually, but the idea being, let's ensure that 77% who are walking in the door next year, if the statistic remains the same, are prepared to know what they have to do and how to execute in that role. So
that's an amazing, 77% is an amazing statistic, but it just shows how that board composition is changing, and I want to come back to that. But I want to explore an issue right now that's really a very hot issue on everybody's mind about ESG. I think everybody read the Business Roundtable Association of CEOs. There's 192 or 93, 181 signed the pledge. Really moving from stakeholder primacy or excuse me, from shareholder primacy to stakeholder privacy. And a pledge, and if you haven't read it, you can download it, it's worth reading. But it talks about stakeholders being employees, suppliers, and the surrounding community. This comes at a time when ESG, environment, social, and governance, which means something different to, I bet, if we surveyed the people in this room and you talked about how you've talked about that on your boards, it would mean different things. It's got different metrics. It's got different understanding of what people do, what people should do. But it comes at a time when that criteria has come to play a role more and more in decisions about how to allocate financial investment. Obviously, Larry Fink, who you all know from BlackRock, has repeatedly backed the notion that corporations should pursue a purpose as well as beyond simple profits, which are very measurable. Companies and boards are responsible for doing the right thing. I love this quote. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, says that a sense of purpose together with a mission that is aligned with what the world needs is a powerful way for his company to earn public trust. Yet groups of shareholders have now found this pledge extremely controversial. What are you forgetting about us? I thought it was at the center of us. So it really brings about this dialogue of, is this mutually exclusive relative to meeting the pledge? This has also brought a focus on CEO pay. Well, maybe the CEO should just not pay themselves as much and pay the employees. Employee rights and things like Walmart selling guns or not selling bullets for certain types of guns. Many boards are focused on ESG, but the question is whether boards have the knowledge and means to convert what all that I just said into how you actually govern over ESG. So we could all just run away and stick our head in the sand and say, well, this is just another thing, and a bunch of, Sustainalytics and the SASB. By the way, SASB is having a public comment I saw in my email this morning on 9/19, so wake up early and do that. But Sandra, what are you seeing on your boards relative to how you're addressing, understanding, dialoguing around, and communicating around ESG?
Yeah. So sticking your head in the sand is something that sounds like a good idea every now and then, especially about this topic. It is too late to do that, though. This is a topic that is front and center. And what we're finding is the governance part of it has been a big issue for some years now. And in some industries, even 70% of the shareholder proposals that come in, the activist proposals that come in, are focused on the governance piece and not on the environmental piece, even though that's what we seem to hear so much about now. Because everyone out there has a different idea of what the E and the G mean, it's really hard for a company to say, I'm going to target this for environmental and that for social, and that's it. There's no way to win, and you don't know where any one industry or the country as a whole will go in terms of how it wants to measure and define the E and the S. So my recommendation to my boards has been, we just do what's right. The utility industry, we know we need to reduce carbon emissions. Do we want to commit that we're going to reduce by 70% by X date? Maybe we're not quite there yet, but we're getting close. With better information, we're getting close. But we know that we need to start working or continue working towards meeting those goals. Long gone are the days when a corporation only cared about the financial performance. And we do have to be good corporate citizens, so we have to take into account all of those different components. Until there's something better defined, though, we pick those that we think we can address or that most need to be addressed and focus energy on that. And that means that those items are front and center on your agenda.
Yeah, that's excellent. And we're going to talk about a component of that on climate change, and I'm very familiar with being on 3 energy boards. But before we go there, Peter, so you talk to a lot of CEOs about ESG and the investing public. We talked a little bit in the preparation about this being potentially an opportunity as well, not just an assessment of risk, but an opportunity. How do you think about balancing those factors in terms of opportunity and risk associated with ESG?
I got to take a step back before I take a
Sure,
step
of
forward,
course.
if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because the Business Roundtable pronouncement really is an interesting step in this whole world. I got the embargoed announcement about 3 days before they came out with it, and they wanted to just let me know that this was going on. And I applaud them for the effort. I think it's got some challenges to it, and the way we look at it is, for years, all of our publications have been talking about stakeholder considerations, that it's broader than just the shareholders. But this idea of primacy is something that word itself is a little bit of a double-edged sword in terms of where does the primacy lie. Because those of you that are on public company boards, you obtained your seat because the shareholders voted you in. And those shareholders can vote you out too. And that's the thing that I think is a little bit lost in the BRT statement. Because, yeah, you have to, there's no way to create long-term value without considering all the stakeholders. You have to consider your employee base. You have to consider the community in which you operate, the environmental issues. All of these factors come to play. But shareholders are a little bit more than a capital infusion. And they have rights. And Delaware law, which most corporation law is based upon, factors in those rights. So the business judgment rule is one of those factors. So the way we operate as corporations is based in law, number one. And I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me for that. But there's some sticky wickets here. And I started getting calls from some fairly prominent lawyers going, yeah, maybe not. And when you talk about stakeholder considerations, that's one thing. When you talk about stakeholder primacy, that's a whole different one. And I think we're going to have to debate this a little bit while and figure out how we focus in a little bit stronger on long-term value creation and not necessarily the primacy argument, except when it comes to this right of shareholders, the agency theory, that you buy a share, you get a vote. And that vote is a very powerful tool. Your employees may be shareholders, they may have a vote, but they're not the 70% institutional votes that are coming in. And your community doesn't have a vote at all, necessarily. There are different ways that they can factor that in. But I applaud the Business Roundtable for taking this approach, but I also approach it with a little bit of caution as to think a little bit about where does the law lie. I know Marty Lipton's out there going, don't worry about this stuff. That's not important. It is important. It is important because it's based on the protections that you enjoy when you sit in the boardroom based on Delaware corporation law. So just be a little cautious of it. What was the second part of the question that I have to go? I had to go backwards before I go.
It was worth it.
I don't think I remember. It's interesting. It's like we're taking the political agenda. We're saying, you ask me a question, but I'll answer.
Yeah, I've done a lot of media training.
I said that in the last program. It's like, we'll just answer the question. No, I'll make a follow-on because as you're talking, and I know you were part of ISS and you follow who follows shareholder trends, right? And this one I see, the worry I have is, well, first of all, that companies just make this compliance checking. It's just check the box, let's do this, not thinking about the strategy, not thinking about the risks. But also that we get loads of metrics that we end up loading into some spreadsheet and just following that may or may not be applicable. So how is this, and it can be either one of you, but I know, Peter, you're involved in what the dynamism is there, is what's going to happen in this area in terms of these, I would call it a cottage industry, right, cropping up, whether it be Sustainalytics or, I don't know that the SASB's cottage, but anyway, what do you think's really, where is this headed from a measurement perspective?
Well, this is, I have to humbly admit my naivete in certain areas. And I did a panel a few months back. It was an ESG panel for the National Investor Relations Institute, so all the investor relations professionals that are out there that serve your companies. And the way they structured it was the first panel was ESG investors. So they had Wellington Management and they had BlackRock and they had they brought up tons of different investors to talk about why they need the information that they're asking of the companies. And then they had a whole panel of directors. I was on a panel with Paul Adkins and somebody from the Edison Electric Institute, which you may be, we helped them create their ESG approach. But I was sitting in the audience and waiting for my turn on the panel. And, you know, you mentioned I used to work for ISS. Some people say that I was on the dark side, and my ISS friends say, now I've gone to the dark side, but it depends on your lens, I guess. But that was a long time ago. And I remember sitting in the audience listening to the investor panel talk about the information flow and why they demanded all the different pieces of information that they were demanding. And each investor was demanding different pieces of information. And it dawned on me that this isn't a social issue to them. And it made me mad because I thought it was a social issue. When you start thinking about ESG and investing, I go back to the days of Series and Bride Principles and went back in my ISS days, which was in the 90s. That was a long time ago. But all of a sudden I went, this is about portfolio return. It is really not about an environmental issue for them. Now, some of them, it is. Some of them are environmental, they're sustainability investing type. A lot of them, I mean, Goldman Sachs, for instance, you said your daughter's in them. I just met with Goldman Sachs. Their ESG portfolio is 5 times as large today as it was 2 years ago, their ESG investing portfolio. All of them are dumping money into the ESG portfolios. Every institutional investor is spending a tremendous amount in this area. It's not necessarily about sustainable investing. It is about portfolio returns and the competitive areas around portfolio returns. So I'm sitting in the audience listening to this and the light bulb goes off in my head and I got mad. I got really mad as I was sitting there. And then I had to think, well, now I got to get up on stage with Paul Adkins, he's no quiet person one way or the other. And I got to temper this down a little bit. But what is happening and the challenge that ESG investing presents to boards is this information flow. There is no harmonization among what data they are asking. So if you've got 30 institutional investors who are your primary holders in your public float, they may all come to you with a different set of data that they're demanding around ESG. And then you've got the the ratings group. So S&P is now rating you on your ESG reporting. Sustainalytics is part of this, SASB is part of this, MSCI is part of this. There's a whole host of people that are now rating you globally. And their ratings criteria is all different. So the challenge this presents to boards is how do we somehow get to a concise set of metrics that we're going to, or data that we are going to deploy to the investing community about what we're doing here. Because without that concise set of data and or this is what we're going to do, you're going to have to respond. And you're going to have to respond to 30, 40, 50 different inquiries around data, which means that all those folks that you have deployed against ESG are now reporting people, not necessarily focused on the issue of ESG or the issues that are pertained in ESG. The other fear factor I have in this is without some harmonization among the raters, there's a default standard that's going to happen. You always go to what do you have to do as opposed to how do I fulfill all these requests? What do I have to do? Well, guess who's going to be rating companies on ESG? ISS. Who do you have to go through every year when your proxy statement is issued? Every year you go through the ISS dance. Whatever side of that dance you want to be on, you have to go through this. They're now rating companies. So when they start rating and giving out grades next year, was when they said they were going to do this, and you start getting a D from ISS, and that goes out to BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard, State Street, First Boston, you name it, who do you think you're going to have to respond to? And is that really where we want to be putting that much power, is in the hands of ISS? I'm a former employee, I admit it, it was a long time ago, a galaxy far, far away. But I was there, and they scare me. The power they wield in this environment is undue. They are, They're a private company, all right? They have a client base. They're consulting, just like many of you have your own companies. They're a little different. They wield an awful lot of power, and in this ESG world, that scares me a little bit, because until we get some harmonization, and I think SASB's moving in this direction to create some consolidated reporting, that this is what we have to have in order to rate these companies. ISS is going to become the default standard, and I really don't think that's a good idea. But
And this is an area like you mentioned, Sandra, with nuclear energy. I mean, where you really educate yourself, because it is an evolving. I know I went to a session on some of the SASB standards. They have them by industry, various components. I mean, it's very, and obviously they're still using the input channel to be able to develop some of this. But one of the areas I want to talk about that's kind of a sub in that, but first of all, before we do that, how many people in this room, actually in the company you work for, boards you're on, actually issue an ESG report?
really,
That's it.
that's going to
few.
change.
That is going to change. That is, it is going to change. And one of the areas, of course, I'm on the board of 3 energy companies, is then a climate change report. And it's just not limited to energy, as we know, right? But this is obviously evolving. Companies are feeling their way towards a response to the fundamental market changes involving international politics, governmental regulation, and investor expectations around climate change. The struggle is to deal with climate change is beginning to transform the economics of extractive industries and obviously other industries. So, Sandra, a question for you, and I'll chime in on this one too. Yeah. It's okay. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures have, better known as TCFD, yeah, more acronyms, have clear guidelines for how boards should provide insight on climate-related risks. How are your boards providing oversight, and how are you disclosing that to external stakeholders?
Sure. You know, if Peter were still at ISS, we'd probably disclose even more, because we'd have someone who truly understood the issues and who could be a more sympathetic, caring listener. But, you know, if you think about the proxy statement, that's one place that we're starting to make those disclosures. And it first started with the compensation discussion in the proxy, where you were talking about what drove the incentive compensation. But now there's more and more about the strategy, and it's starting to touch on ESG and other issues around it, climate change impacts, and just in general the risks that the company is facing. So that's one of the main ways that we're seeing it. There are lots of Peter talked today about Edison Electric and other organizations that are really starting to disclose some of their data. They may be disclosing it to their own group, but it's public information. And that means that they understand that they have to start sharing data with others. It's not bothered any of my companies so far, because that's just the way the world is going. I am concerned about ISS and how it interprets what it hears, but if at the same time we're informing ISS, we can also inform some of our investors who may think on their own, maybe not the BlackRocks and others yet, but if we can inform enough people over a long enough period of time, maybe that disclosure that we're making that puts us at risk can also help us get some allies who can better understand the problems that we have.
And I want to, before we come back to climate change, in terms of some of the things I'm seeing, Peter, a question for you that has come from the audience. We have 2 questions here, and I promise I'll get to the Boeing question also. But this one is on ESG reporting, so it's very, very relevant here. The SEC and regulators can play a role in harmonization and reporting. What is ISS doing to work with the regulators? Or not, or...
Yeah, I don't know the answer to what ISS is doing, but you're right, the SEC can play a role here. They've chosen thus far to be fairly quiet about the disclosure elements of what they're going to do. That may be because it may be in process and they haven't come out with anything yet. I really don't know what ISS is doing with the SEC, because I know they just did the probably the third round of reviews through the GAO of
Yeah.
should the proxy advisory firms be regulated in some way, shape, or form. So I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's probably on the horizon and probably not too far. The thing that's challenging about ESG in that disclosure requirement kind of realm is exactly what you were talking about with Edison Electric. Edison Electric is the I don't want to call them the trade association, but they're the trade group behind the electric utilities. And they went collectively to their shareholder base and said, all right, in the electric utility world only, what do you need from us from an ESG reporting standpoint? So they went to the largest institutional investors and said, what data do you need? And they created a framework and said, this is what we're going to supply. And all you electric utilities, this is what you disclose, and that's it. Now, many of them are electric and gas. They didn't even go to the gas side of the equation, and that's the challenge is as you get into conglomerates and multifaceted businesses, the disclosure is going to be different all the way across. And we helped Edison Electric do this. We actually went out with surveys and got data for them because I think that's where this is going to end up going is industry specific in terms of how you disclose and what you disclose.
Just the unique characteristic.
Yeah.
And on the industry, I know we have, obviously energy folks that are in here who are dealing with this, but some thoughts on that is what I'm seeing on my boards is specific committee responsibilities and charters that really address climate and how you're going to have a strategy around it, the factors of assessing scenario planning. I mean, it's like going into a world in which all the factors, supply, demand, pricing, all those things are up in the air. None of them are, we don't all have crystal balls on that. And they all impact, obviously, the scenarios. So being able to understand that, how you assess risk, deliver results, the resilience, I think Chevron uses a lot in their report, not just limited to Chevron, but resilience in terms of the portfolio, being able to adapt to the various scenarios that are out there. Actions being taken around innovations, reductions in flaring, managing methane emissions, investing in low carbon technologies, innovations and innovators, and yes, metrics. Metrics that are chosen to be able to show trends and address some of the key things that are being measured in that space. So we're going to see a lot more evolve in climate. The key questions are how this will be interpreted, come into the scene, obviously. And one thing too is how activism will change as a result of this. We already see obviously activism around environmental, but how will it combine some of the elements around the financial with the environmental and present challenges to the board? So a very interesting thing indeed. I want to ask this, it's kind of out before we go into technology and then some of the NACD initiatives. We could probably spend all day on this, but I think it's worth, I mentioned in the intro, the Boeing board, in the transparency and accountability. So the question that came in is, how could the Boeing board know the fine details of a plane computer system? Is it not a culture issue at Boeing? And is that where the board failed? So any thoughts on that?
Well,
We always throw one zinger in there. Thank you.
Go ahead, Sandra.
oh, thank you so very much. And I honestly...
I have to be careful, they're members,
I don't have, of course, don't have an answer to that. I will say, though, that when things fail as badly as they failed with Boeing, there is a culture issue, but how you get your arms around it and understand it is difficult. So many companies now are doing culture audits, and those audits are meant to provide information about not only what's happening inside the company, but they sometimes do these audits outside the company so that they get at least a feel for what the motivations are, what the concerns are, and what the risks are in the company. So was it a culture issue at Boeing? Probably, because if there had been enough of a safe feeling that people could talk and share and do the right things, we might not have had that problem. But how do you make it work perfectly? I don't think we have the answer to that yet.
You know, it's hard about culture because you know when it's wrong. You know when things go wrong. It's hard to measure before then. But all the things, and there's a whole nother session we can spend really on culture because it is. I mean, how does a board really get its arms around? You're right. I mean, it's a plain system, right? It's in the bowels of the operations. You have safety committees, that sort of thing. Were they there? Were they active in that? So it's obviously a transparency issue that obviously they'll need to deal with. Sandra, I want to spend just a few minutes before we go into some of the NACD initiatives on technology. And we talked about this. You're on the board of a utility company. You're talking about opportunity of using home systems and having insight into consumer behaviors. There's also cyber risk associated with the other side of it. How do you balance on technology, the use of technologies and the risks associated?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we find is that it's probably better if we not only follow what's happening out in our consumer community, but if we try to introduce new technology to them, because then we're being able to do it on platforms that we think can be supported well by the infrastructure of the organization. Can't always control that. So that there will always be things that people want to tag on to the software systems of the organization, even unbeknownst to them. They don't realize they're doing it, but just in using certain technologies, they're demanding that we allow that interface. It is, I don't know, it's risky, and it's not just in the apps that people use, but utility companies use drones to check lines and see where trees might be overgrowing so that they'll break the lines. A lot of those drones now, we've learned, have Chinese parts, and some of them can't be used anymore. So there are those risks that we have to balance. The only way we can balance is to try to keep ahead of them where we can, and where we can't run as fast as we can to close those firewalls behind them.
Right. And, you know, when you talk about that, to me, this is another area where education of directors, getting the right composition of people on the board that understand enough about the technology, this is the challenge, right? Especially when you're using it as a competitive advantage and really needing to understand, really work with management on strategy. So Peter, with that, I want to go back to this board composition because I know, and there's a great, actually, question from the audience that is incorporated in this. I want you to talk about the initiatives that NACD has and NACD Next, because it's a big deal. It's honoring honorees who are actually changing their board compositions, looking at diversity and inclusion. And think about this question, too, as you're answering, if you would, which is you discuss the need to focus more on the future and strategy, but the type experience and skills being sought for board members remains the same, P&L responsibility. So obviously, whether you agree or not with that completely, what is NACD doing to look at this changing board composition and really do something about it?
Sure. Well, I mean, when you take it all down to brass tacks, the sign over there underneath the podium, you know, elevating board performance, that's our mission. That's what we do. And we have to look at it from a variety of different standpoints. So education is primary to that. And I'm somewhat preaching to the choir of the 150 people that are in the room today. You're already bought into that or you wouldn't be sitting here, right? It's the other thousands of people that aren't sitting in a room like this having these discussions and thinking about some of these issues. Next was created really around diversity and inclusion and exemplifying those boards that had made strides in that area. But it's also thinking about the next generation of directors and how that plays into the diversity and inclusion dialogue. And that diversity can be way broader than race and gender, obviously. It can be age, as we were discussing earlier. Do we go to younger directors with different viewpoints? And so we launched it last year with a gala celebrating 4 companies that had made strides in this area of different sizes and what they had done to kind of use that as an example. Over the course of the year, we have been holding roundtables around the country around Next, and the idea of developing a framework. And our partner in this is Deloitte. And Deloitte has offered up a lot of resources behind this in terms of building a framework that we can deploy to all different size companies to think differently about diversity and inclusion and how we change the composition of our boards. In addition to the roundtables and the gala, which the next gala is at Summit in 3 weeks now. So last year we had 20 companies that were nominated for winners. This year we had 44 companies nominated, and we have different categories this year. So we're continuing to build on this with the idea of if we can look at what some of these progressive companies are doing and exemplify the practices, maybe some that aren't as progressive can learn from that and look at some of the steps that they've taken in order to diversify their boards and get that different thinking about composition coming to play. How many of you have listened to our podcast, Future Fluency?
It's great.
I would recommend that there are, I think, 8 episodes now, maybe 9 episodes. Go back and take a listen to that. And there's sessions on unconscious bias, there's sessions on diversity, there's sessions on you name it. It's called Future Fluency. It's on Stitcher and a whole bunch of the podcast venues. It's really, really well done. And you want to talk about some insights as to how people think and how we got to think a little bit differently when it comes to board composition. I think the skill set question that came up from the audience, people are still looking for P&L responsibility. That's a big factor. But I think if you look at that stat that I threw out there before, that 77% of the new directors who are elected this year have never been on public company boards before, that is an indication that the mindset's shifting a little bit, and they are pushing into a little bit deeper, that it's not just the CEO who has that P&L responsibility. It may be the division leader for IBM, who's not one of the 5 NEOs in the proxy statement, who's running a fairly substantial P&L that is way bigger than most private companies out there, that they're not a named officer, and they may have a very deep expertise in one area or another. The discussion around cyber comes up all the time in terms of, is that a skill set that we need to go after for our board? The technology side of the equation is an offshoot of that. ESG is now becoming a factor. Do we need somebody that is really well-versed on this for some of the bigger companies to be in the boardroom to have those discussions? I'm not really sure. And every board's got to figure out that need for themselves. So I am never one to say, you must have this, you must have this, you must have this. Depending on what the board already has, you need to think about how you balance out. But I think as we think about next and in diversity and inclusion, we think about the different skill sets that are out there. The key to me in terms of board composition is widening the net. If you go to your networks that you've traditionally always gone to, you're going to get the same people. But if you widen that net a little bit and you start looking at what are different groups have to offer, what can they bring to the table that will change the dialogue in our boardroom, then you're really thinking about getting that broader sense of looking at strategy and looking at the culture of our own board, so it's not just the same people moving from one board to the next. And I could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to stop.
But I think, I'm getting that velvet hook basically pulls us off. We could talk about a lot more things. We hope both of you will come back in the future. And I truly appreciate and I'm honored to have served on this panel with you. And thank you for all your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.